Good morning, everyone, again, and welcome to the first BusinessWise Insiders of 2023. So in a moment, I'll start the presentation, which will run for about 20 minutes, and I'll keep everyone on mute during this portion of the session, just to minimize disruptions and keep things running smoothly. And then after the presentation, we'll gather back together in small groups, and you'll get a chance to introduce yourselves, ask questions, share ideas about today's topic, or anything else that's on your mind as you start 2023. And if you do have questions during the presentation, you can either ask them in the chat window or save them for the breakout discussion. So let's turn to today's topic. So today we're going to look at what we call the science of B2B sales. So stats and formulas to help you generate more good leads in 2023. And there are a few reasons we like this topic and revisit it from time to time. First, there's a lot of conventional wisdom about what works and what doesn't in B2B lead gen, how to prospect and sell. And it's often easy to overlook the fact that there are actual hard numbers that can help guide our prospecting strategy and make it more successful. And then second, the numbers we'll cover today or next year or the year after that will offer a snapshot of the current state of B2B business development, including the trends that are likely to shape our profession for the coming year or 2 years. So it's a great way to get up to speed and adjust your approach to be able to successfully navigate what's coming your way, both in terms of challenges and opportunities. So I wanted to start with a little challenge to see where your mind goes first when it comes to putting numbers to some key prospecting tactics. So I've just opened a poll with each of the questions here on the screen to give everyone a chance to weigh in with their answers. It's all anonymous, so no pressure, just go with your gut. But the three questions are, with respect to cold calling, on average, how many dials does it take to have a live conversation with a prospect? On email prospecting, on average, what percentage of your prospecting emails will be opened by a prospect? And then generally, with respect to lead generation, what's the most important element in lead gen success? Your list, your offer, or your delivery? In other words, the words you use, your presentation, the design. To think about those, take your time. I'll leave the poll open as I continue with the presentation, but we'll return to this either later in the presentation or in the breakout sessions to sort of compare what we'll reveal today with sort of your initial gut reaction on these questions. And an important point here is that it doesn't really matter whether you consider yourself a sales artist, where you read people, trust your instincts, and are confident that you'll put on your best performance when it counts, or whether you consider yourself more of a sales scientist with a go-to process based on careful analysis of what works. Sales reps at both ends of this spectrum can benefit from understanding the numbers and using them to build an approach that plays to their strengths and maximizes outcomes. So before I start looking at the stats in the presentation, Deborah, did you have any other introductory thoughts on the topic today?
Whether you're a new seller or an old veteran like I am, I think it's important to remember that things are changing all of the time, and in the last few years, accelerating at a greater pace. And it's important to realize that these numbers do change. What happened in my earlier career with regard to cold calling, and there was no emailing early in my career. So I think this has a tremendous amount of value, and be willing to change because the world around us is.
Thanks, Deb. So that brings us to our first set of trends and statistics, where we'll focus on cold calling. And we'll start here for a couple of reasons. First, the topic of cold calling generates a lot of strong feelings, to say the least, and whether you love it or hate it, you're probably pretty sure your cold calling philosophy is the right one, and you have your reasons. And second, when it comes to measuring success, cold calling is a lot more nebulous than lead generation using digital channels like email. It takes a lot more effort to determine what works and what doesn't. And even the best data can be imprecise, but that doesn't mean there aren't hard numbers that can help guide your strategy. So as we set out to determine whether cold calling is worth your time and how to craft a prospecting strategy that makes the best use of your cold calling time, we need to know how much time really goes into each successful call. So according to Jason Bay of Outbound Squad, it takes 20 to 25 dial attempts to make one completed call. And according to our experience, it takes somewhere between 5 and 10 completed calls on average to set an appointment. Now, these may be different from your own experience or what you've read, but they're certainly in the range of what a typical B2B sales rep can expect in terms of cold calling metrics. And if you use our figures and take them to their logical conclusion, it reinforces the concept that cold calling isn't easy. It can take between 100 to 250 dials just to set that one appointment. So the flip side of this equation is that it means that most sales reps are likely to give up on cold calling before it produces results, which can create a big advantage for the reps who are willing to put in the time, craft a plan that focuses on their best prospects and that they can stick to. But a key point that has emerged from recent trends on cold calling, as well as the evolution of other forms of sales prospecting, is that your cold calling time in particular must be spent really wisely. If it's going to take this many calls to set appointments, you want to be sure those appointments are really worth the effort. So when you think about cold calling, don't think about having to call every single prospect in your demographic target market. Think about your absolute best prospects and focus your valuable cold calling time there. So how do you ensure your cold calling strategy is focused on the right prospects? And our statistic here is that sales reps spend up to 40% of their cold calling time just looking for someone to call. And when you think about that in the combination with the previous stat, that's pretty staggering. With so many dials required to complete a call, every second of your cold call time is precious. And some reps are spending as much as 40% of it not making dials at all. They're instead looking for people to call in the first place. And the corollary is that when you start off with a list of top prospects, you can then spend the majority of your cold calling time actually dialing. And over time, you'll set a lot more appointments than if you're constantly in that search mode. And then finally, once again, prioritize. Even if you use BeWise or another similar tool where you can instantly access contact info for thousands of prospects, it's critical to be as focused as possible. Sales reps should really have more than one list. They should have multiple tiered lists tailored to their various prospecting channels. And with cold calling, it's all about those top prospects. And our third cold calling stat brings us full circle and helps answer the question, does cold calling actually still work? And this is a stat from a Rain Group survey within the past couple of years. So it's a true reflection of today's environment. 82% of buyers have taken a meeting after conversations have started with a cold call. So the next time you hear someone in sales talking about how much they hate cold calling or how much they hate receiving cold calls, remember this stat. In practice, it still works. It's still far more common than not for decision makers to have had conversations resulting from cold calls. And part of the reason for that is the difference between cold calling in the abstract, which most people consider to be negative, and cold calling in practice, where sales reps who are persistent and who can speak to their prospects' challenges and priorities can create real opportunities for constructive engagement. And moving on, here's one stat that really shows how much the B2B sales landscape has changed over the years. 90% of B2B buyers research products online before purchasing. And this probably isn't all that surprising given the explosion of digital selling over the past several years, but the point it underscores may not be what you're expecting. And that's that since buyers are more informed than ever, your role as a sales rep has fundamentally changed. Your job is no longer to identify pain as a way to introduce prospects to your solution. In other words, to introduce new choices in their path to solve problems and address priorities. Instead, your job is to streamline and clarify your prospects' choices by offering information and insights that they don't already have. And as a result, despite the fact that we operate in this increasingly digital landscape, the value of human guidance has actually increased. And the best way to deliver that guidance is in an actual human conversation, like a cold call. So to close out this section, just a few quick bonus stats on voicemail. 60 to 80% of calls go to voicemail and only 10% are returned. 48% of sales reps never make a follow-up attempt after a cold call. And on average, sales reps leave 70 voicemails per day. And the point here is that obviously voicemail is an increasingly key element of successful cold calling. So I wanted to offer just a few quick tips that you may want to try to improve your voicemails and generate more callbacks. One that we like to preach here at BusinessWise is to use a voicemail email combination. So don't rely solely on the voicemail to get a callback. Use it to set up a follow-up email. And by doing so, you'll amplify both messages. You can either reference an opportunity, a specific opportunity that you have and that you can connect your prospect with, or a competitor of theirs that is a client of yours. Both are good, tangible, sticky things that can really succeed in generating more callbacks. And on the right, just some quick tips. Keep it short. You don't want to overwhelm or annoy your prospect. So 25 seconds is sort of a good maximum to aim for. Repeat your contact info. That makes it as easy as possible for your prospect to get back to you. And then really practice. Successful voicemails shouldn't be too rigid and they shouldn't be too casual. So rehearse to strike that right balance. Before I move on, Deb, did you want to mention anything about cold calling?
Plan and practice would be my two go-to words of the day. The plan would have to do with making sure that you have your right target market and that small group of dream prospects that you want to keep calling over and over again until you find a reason to remove them from your list. Plan your voicemail script. It should be short and quick and easy, and use our new template opportunity so that when you do follow up with your email, it just takes a second or two to make it happen. And keep practicing what you want to say when a real person does answer the phone, because those are those golden opportunities you don't want to mess up.
Thanks, Deb. So that brings us to our second set of stats, and this time we're going to be dealing with email prospecting. So 2 points before I dive into this section. First, we all send and receive a lot of emails, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing on one specific kind of email, and those are the emails that sales reps send with the goal of starting a conversation and setting an appointment with a new prospect. And if you're not already sending these kinds of emails or campaigns on a regular basis with a well thought out strategy, we'd be more than happy to discuss how and why to start doing that. And then secondly, I want to encourage you to think about cold calling stats and email prospecting stats, not as two separate sets of information about two distinct prospecting methods, and instead think about what the stats about cold calling say about the relative merits of email prospecting and vice versa. Because really the ultimate goal here is to find the right mix of prospecting methods and how precisely to use those methods in combination with each other to achieve the best results for your effort. So we started our cold call stats with dial attempts required to complete calls and set appointments. And similarly, I wanted to start our email prospecting section with some baseline figures about what to expect as far as opens and replies. As our clients know, we offer email lead gen services using a couple of different approaches. And what we typically see as far as results are an open rate in the range of 10 to 25% and a reply rate in the range of 0.5 to 3%. And just like with cold calling, it's important to have a realistic set of expectations for email prospecting. I think a lot of the time, just because email prospecting is less labor intensive, people think it's automatically going to be more successful, and that's obviously not the case. And with email, that's compounded by the fact that only a small number of the people who do reply will be prospects who are eagerly accepting your request for an appointment. Most will be along the lines of, I'm happy with my current vendor or not interested. But because email prospecting is easily measurable, you know pretty quickly if a particular strategy is working, so you can continuously refine and improve. So our second email prospecting stat gets at the most common objection to email lead gen, which comes from both senders and receivers of email, that cold email amounts to spam. And this stat is a pretty strong argument against that notion. 57% of email recipients consider a message spam not because it's unsolicited, but because it's not relevant to their needs. So just like with cold calling, if you root your email prospecting strategy in providing value to your prospects, they're much less likely to consider it spam. And building on the previous stat, where we set expectations about what kinds of responses you might get, value and relevance in email prospecting often comes down to demonstrating what the prospect gets from an appointment, even if they never become a client. It's that value that will turn a not interested into a conversation and ultimately into a meeting. So moving on, here's one stat that you may have come across before. It's always pretty eye-opening. For every $1 spent on email marketing, the average return on investment is $42. And hopefully this is obvious, but it comes with a big caveat. Not all email lead gen generates this high in ROI. To be successful, emails need to target the right audience, speak to prospects' challenges and priorities, be consistent. And given that email ROI isn't always this great, I always debate whether to even include it in the presentation, but for fear of creating those unrealistic expectations. But we've heard a few recent stories from clients who have successfully used automated email prospecting to close really big sales. And it reminded me of a point that it's especially important in the B2B world. The average size of a deal in many industries is so large that it only takes a few wins to achieve this kind of astronomical ROI. So it really pays to use email and to stick with it. And then finally, email ROI isn't just about the leads and deals you get directly from email replies. Email can help warm up leads that you close through other channels or at a later date. And then here's a new stat for this year's presentation that reinforces some of the same themes I've already touched on. Following up with a prospect multiple times can double your cold email response rate. So whether it's email or cold calling, we've talked about how often sales reps give up after a first attempt, and this shows how big a mistake that can be. The inbox is a crowded place. Not every message gets through every time, and follow-ups remind prospects that you're there and increase the odds you'll reach the right prospect at the right time. And finally, when it comes to ensuring regular, consistent follow-up, automated campaigns where you send a series of sequenced emails to the prospects into your audience are a real game changer. And finally, a few quick bonus stats that can help you think about effective email strategies. The first two here get to the fact that timing and personalization really matter and reinforce the broader point that email is much more easily measurable than cold calling. So use that power to determine what works and modify your approach accordingly. And then the last stat that 80% of buyers prefer receiving cold emails to cold phone calls is another one that's relatively recent. I wanted to include it because it shows the importance of diversification in your biz dev strategy. Different prospects respond to different types of prospecting outreach, so it's good to have a mix. And just as important, if you're not using email as a prospecting tool, you're missing a lot of opportunities. The more efficiently you use email, the more prospects you reach, the more opportunities you'll be able to capitalize on. Deborah, anything from you to close out the email section?
I think you've said it all, Sam.
Great. So now for our last section, we're going to turn away from statistics and toward a few formulas that we like to use to help our clients generate more and better leads. These aren't necessarily scientific hard and fast rules, but rather frameworks that can help ensure your focus is in the right place. So the first formula is the 40-40-20 rule. And previous insiders, attendees have heard us talk about this a lot. We talk about it in relation to all aspects of sales and lead gen, and it helps us stay focused on the big picture. It's the idea that the vast majority of lead gen success comes from two basic concepts: your list and your offer. So often sales reps are focused on the other, the 20%, what to say to prospects, and to a lesser extent on the offer, the specific value that your prospect gets from what you're trying to help them accomplish. And they kind of forget about the importance of the list, or they overlook how important it is to invest time in crafting a list that's really focused. But if you start off by focusing on who you're talking to and the value you're going to provide, your biz dev strategy will be way ahead of the game. Here's another way to think about it. If your cold calling or email prospecting isn't generating the results that you'd expect, your first instinct might be to tweak your cold call script or change your email subject line. Next time, think about who you're targeting and whether you're providing real value at every step of the process. And if you address those, you may find that your basic scripts are fine, and that it was the underlying fundamentals that needed more attention. Our next formula is the 70-30 rule of prospect engagement. And this one's pretty simple, especially when it comes to offering value to your prospect. When engaged with a prospect, the conventional wisdom is to spend at least 70% of your time listening and no more than 30% of your time talking. And that's because successful sales isn't about your product, it's about your prospect's priorities. And when you do talk, you should be direct, ask questions, and focus on your prospect. Listen for opportunities to provide insights that can give them value and change their perspective on how they should be thinking about their problems and priorities. But now I'm going to throw a wrench in the gears, because here's a stat that I came across while preparing for this presentation from the company Gong Revenue Intelligence. And they found that in the context of cold calling specifically, the most successful sales reps actually talk slightly more than they listen. And I found that curious at first, But then after I thought about it, I realized it emphasizes a really important point about today's B2B sales prospecting landscape. As I mentioned, today's sales reps really need to demonstrate the value they bring, the value that their prospect receives from a conversation or meeting. And you can't really show your value in the tight confines of a cold call if all you're doing is asking questions and listening. Instead, you may need to talk a little more to show that you have the ideas, insights, and experiences that will help your prospects solve their problems and address priorities. So something to think about, especially in relation to cold calling. And then to put an even finer point on it, you have to do it really quickly. Think about it as if you have 5 seconds to earn 5 minutes. So in other words, if you're not clear at the very beginning on the kind of value you're going to provide, your prospect won't give you any more of his or her time. And then one final framework to close out the presentation. And as you look ahead to 2023 in terms of goal setting, I came across this at the beginning of last year, and I found it really helpful in striking the right mental balance between the daily grind on one hand and those big annual goals we always think about. The idea is that we overestimate what we can accomplish in a single day, but we underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. So don't get discouraged if you can't get to your to-do list every day, and instead focus on sticking to it. Do as much as you can every single day, and over time, those daily actions will compound and small actions will turn into big things. I think this is especially true in sales prospecting, where the process can feel like it's failing when you zoom into a specific day where you didn't do or accomplish what you wanted or get the results you were hoping for. So in those moments this year, remember to zoom out, stick with it, because if you do, you're much more likely to achieve and exceed those big long-term goals that you set. So before we finish out, Deb, did you have any final comments?
Well, not only is new business development and sales prospecting important to think about it as the long game, not only in terms of what you as an individual are doing each day, but the whole process is a long-term process. And if you decide to try cold email prospecting or cold calling, and you say, I'm going to give it a month or I'm going to give it 6 months, you're going to be in trouble, because it's all about doing it consistently, always. And that's what makes the difference, and it will succeed.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks again, everybody, for attending.